Hello, everyone, and welcome to this winter term. We have changed the name of the terms. It's no longer the Lent term. It has become the winter term of the Miguel Dols workshop at the Cañada-Blanch Centre, in which the fellows are going to present the research they are conducting, and they have been conducting here at the LSE since their arrival. And we're honoring Miguel Dols, who's one of the biggest benefactors of the Cañada-Blanch Centre and, of course, the Cañada-Blanch Foundation in Valencia. And we'll then showcase all the experience and the research in economic geography, in economic history, and in political economy that the fellows in this term have. We have 7 presentations, so I'm not going to dwell too much into that, because otherwise we don't finish. Remember that with 7 presentations, what we'll have is a maximum of 20 minutes each. That means a 15-minute presentation, giving time for questions from the audience and also for some feedback from myself towards the end. And without further ado, we're going to start with Professor Burhan Can Karahasan, I hope I pronounced your name correctly, who is going to be talking about the Turkish geography of discontent, territorial inequalities, and political polarization. Jan, the floor is yours.
Okay. So first of all, let me start by thanking to the Cañada-Blanch Institute and particularly to Andres for this visit opportunity here at LSE. It was extremely productive for myself. So what I'm hoping to do is, in my very limited time, I will be talking about this Turkish geography of discontent. So I mean, we are probably very familiar with this revenge of the places that don't matter argument. And I will be talking about how this is working in the Turkish case. So I will be also talking about some other things that are right now going on in the Turkish context as well. But the main narrative of what I'm going to talk about is basically to understand and try to explain how this political spectrum of this Turkey changed after the 2000 parliamentary elections. So in that sense, I will have 2 main questions. Actually, the first question is what I was proposing when I was coming to London, which is basically asking a certain question. What is the impact of the economic decline on the rise of Justice and Development Party, AKP, Adalet Kalkınma Partisi, in the 2002 elections? So this is the first election that AKP, the GDP, I mean, I will probably use them interchangeably, sorry about that, but this is the first time that we see GDP in the political spectrum in 2002. So that's mainly the place of geography of discontent in the research. Now, the second question, which is going to make my thing a bit difficult because I will be probably squeezing my time in the second part, is what about the role of distributive politics? I mean, with endless discussions with Andres, I mean, I start to realize that the second part could be more interesting and novel in certain sense. So I will be thinking that, I mean, if the economic decline has some sort of a power to explain the rise of the GDP in the 2002 elections, and pre-assuming that they are aware of this fact, we need to see how they behave after the 2002 election, because we are talking about like around a 2 decade of political consolidation of the power in a single ruling party, which is quite new in this Turkish context. Now, a couple of things that I have to highlight. I mean, I was planning to talk more about the ideological background of how AKP was entering into the political spectrum, but due to time issues, I'm just going to show you a comparison between 1999 elections and the 2002 elections, just to express that the reshuffling of the discontent or the reaction of the voters and this reflection of the discontent in the ballot box is not an ideological reshuffling. Rather, it's an intra-ideological thing. So here, I mean, a couple of words. This red bar is the People's Republic Party. And this 10%, this is a threshold which, if you're below this threshold, you're not going to be represented in the parliament. Which is to say that this is the main opposition, by the way, at the moment. It was not represented in the parliament before the during the 1999 elections. So we see that in the 2000, they are in the parliament. And this blue bar belongs to another left-wing party, which is the Democratic Left Party. And you see that they are successful. So we see that the party, died away in this the history of the policy in Turkey. Now, what is also interesting is that these group of political parties are the main right-wing political parties, especially the Motherland Party. This is the Nationalist Party, and we also have the EP here, which is also a liberal right-wing party. They were in the parliament, and you see they are no longer in the parliament in the 2002 elections. Then we have the Virtue Party, which is the Fazilet Partisi, which basically has a constitute basically relying to religious fundamentals. And you see that they, because of the Party Closure Act and the court, you see that they are not in the elections in the 2000, and we know that, some of the, members of the party are in the GDP. So we basically see that most of the reshuffling that we are talking about is a reshuffling of the right voters in that sense in the 2002 elections. Okay, I would like to talk more about this, but if you have questions, maybe I come back to them later on because I have some presentations, so some slides on them as well. So this is the geography of the AKP votes in the 2002 elections. So the dark green areas are the ones that are basically the strongholds. So they have a vote share between 44 to 60%. So in these dark green regions, which is, something not surprising because, if we have chance to focus on a synthetic AKP, for instance, which is the composition of the main four right-wing political party in the 1999 elections, you see the dark areas are more or less mimicking about what we are seeing in the 2002 elections. So this is once again to highlight that this discontenting in this rise of GDP is some sort of a reshuffling within the AKP, within the right-wing political spectrum in Turkey. So this is the, for those of us working on Turkey, something a bit boring because this polarization is, the northwestern Marmara district and the western regions are quite persistently doing better compared to the southeastern and the rest of the country. And you see, especially in the eastern, southeastern part, there is a huge polarization and this persistence of the regional income gaps, just to show us that this pattern is more or less quite persistent throughout the time. To show it in a more, in a more remarkable way, I plot 5 main regions. So Istanbul, İzmir, Ankara, I believe you are familiar with these regions. So these are the biggest cities of Turkey. And also we have Bursa and Kocaeli, which are the industrial districts in Turkey. So these 5 regions, when we focus on their contribution to the total GDP, they produce more than 50% and they contribute more than 50% of the total Turkish GDP. By itself, Istanbul is, contributing around 33% something. But when we start to add like İzmir, Ankara, we jump to something between above 40%. But with the industrial districts, we realize that the overall contribution of these 5 regions is more than 50%, which is once more showing us that it's not only the duality, but there is huge heterogeneity and huge, this could be explained by agglomeration, of course. So if you are fine with agglomeration economies, you're going to talk plenty of effectiveness issues here, but this also shows us the unsustainability of the current case. Now, how am I going to explain this? If we are aware that the range of the places are crucial in political perspective, we have, cases from EU, cases from Brexit, and of course, the 2016 presidential elections in the United States, they're all showing us that the declining regions are reacting in the ballot box. But interestingly, when we review the Turkish literature, most of the studies focus on what's going on after 2002. So we try to examine what are the main determinants of the voting patterns for AKP after the 2002 elections. But to my knowledge, there is no direct questioning of the impact of the long-run decline on the rise of AKP or the Justice Development Party. So this is some sort of a gap. There are the consensus that the GDP voters, on average, they are mid-income people, they are less urbanized, and they are mid-educated, especially during the early periods of the rise of the Justice Development Party. Now, what I will do to try to answer the first question is, I basically use the very well-known regional data sets of Turkey. There are plenty of harmonization problems because the 3 data sets that I use in the first set of analysis, they rely on different methodologies. So this is a problem. I do some harmonization things. If you have questions, we can talk about them later on. But basically, I use provincial data, which gives me around 67 regions. So this is the base model, which, you can say that it Could be better to plot a scatter plot, I agree. So I'm uneasy with the first part as well. But what I do is very simple. It's a cross-sectional model. I have world shares of the GDP. This is what I'm trying to explain. And the main interest here is the periodical growth. So I call them as the growth cycles. The cycles are given on the upper part. So if you see these are 5-year cycles. The reason that I choose 5 is like the elections are, I mean, in normal conditions should be in 5 years. And I have like 2 controls at the moment just to see that the composition of the employment. I'm using the share of agricultural population and the share of university graduates to see the impact of the local conditions in my analysis. Now, this is the first set of analysis with very limited observation, and this is cross-sectional, of course. And what I catch in the early stage of my analysis is that if you look at the mid-1980s, the decline coming from mid-1980s has a negative impact on the AKP votes. I mean, if you look at the models from 6 to 10, these are the conditional models. They include like 2 controls at the local level. So we can, I mean, this is of course not causal, but we can argue that the decline has some sort of a relationship with the voting patterns of the AKP in the 2002 elections. So I'm going to pass this quickly because I know that this has some limitations, right? I mean, I hear in your mind that you're saying that, okay, this is just cross-sectional, so we are not controlling for some of the time invariant heterogeneities, which is true. And I mean, with 67 observations, I mean, how much can we talk about what's going on in this Turkish context? So there are some, I mean, not solutions, but some, I mean, backdoors to deal with this. One is spatial models. I'm going to skip this. The other one is to do something a bit unorthodox. So what I do is that I go to this district level electoral data. So I combine the district level electoral data with the regional data set, GDP data set. So I estimate a new set of models by estimating the same linear model, but this time my main outcome is still at province level, but I control for the electoral behavior at the district level, and I also control for the other control variables at the district level as well. So I reach like an observation level of 900. I mean, this is not ideal, but if you are familiar with these kind of studies, we sometimes do these kind of combinations with different layers if we have data issues, but I'm open to suggestions and discussions here. But what I see is that if you look at the 7th and the 8th model, they are quite significant. So it once more validates that the districts that are declining, I mean, districts that are in the provinces that are declining, they are voting more for AKP, right? So this is somehow saying that, okay, I'm not controlling for the intra-province income differences, but still, if a district is in a region, a province that is declining, they're voting more for the Justice Development Party in the 2002 elections. So this is basically what I was planning to do. So if this was the case, I was fine and I was going to close up my presentation, but I know that I have just like around 5 minutes, but I'm going to talk about a second strategy that could be more interesting, which is to talk about, okay, what is next? What happened after 2002? So if we realize that not we, of course, the GDP realizes or aware that the declining regions is a base for the fundamental voting patterns, then a rational individual should think that, okay, I need to do something, right? Because I would be in the revenge of the places that don't matter in the future if there is an economic voting pattern. So there are influential studies. I mean, one is by Andres and Davide Luca. It's about the public expenditure. So they validate that regions that are voting more for AKP, they receive higher public investment. There is another paper, Davide, and he also validates that the regions that are voting more for AKP, they are growing more as well. But I mean, these papers also highlight that these results are a bit dependent on the inclusion of the other social and economic variables, which is an important remark by authors. Now, what I will do is, of course, I'm not going to replicate it, but I'm going to try to explore something unexplored, which is, what if I put this public expenditure or the public policy as a mediator? And what if I try to understand the causal impact of the GDP voting over the indirect effect of the public expenditures on economic growth? So I'm going to just reverse the scenario and focus on this mechanism. So this time treatment will be vote for the GDP, and I will try to explain how it affects the regional growth. So that's a direct mechanism. But the trick that I'm going to do is that, okay, this might not be that central, but what if I have a mediating and indirect channel which works over the public investment? So you invest in regions, and this affects the regional growth. So this is going to be trying to find a way to estimate a set of model, which is the first model, mediator model. The first model tries to see whether regions that are voting for AKP are receiving more public funds. That's equation 1. Then the outcome equation, the final form is here 3. We try to examine whether this voting for AKP has a direct effect on the regional growth, and also the public expenditure proposes an indirect channel, an indirect mediating effect on the regional growth pattern. So that's the second part of the story. And of course, it is possible to compute an average causal mediation effect at the end of the day to be sure that there is an indirect channel working. So this is let's look at panelly, because these are the conditional models. And these are again at district level. So the only the only variable that's observable at the province is, of course, GDP growth and the public expenditure here. Other variables are observable at the district level. So here, this first of all validates the previous findings that regions that are voting more for AKP, they receive higher public expenditure, accumulated public expenditure. So I try to use this accumulated public expenditure for different time intervals. So it shows me that this first line is working. So that's the mediator. So mediating mechanism is working. Now, when I estimate the final equation, look at the first line. The vote share of GDP seems to be having an insignificant influence on the growth patterns, which basically matches with what Davide was highlighting. Because in his paper, it's a world development, very nice paper. He also highlighted that, okay, voting for GDP is affecting regional growth, but it seems to be not that strong because some other economic factors could be in effect. So it was one of his remarks in the paper. But when we look at the impact of public expenditure, we see that both in the unconditional and conditional models, it's highly significant. And the computed causal mediation effects, they are also highly significant. For me, this translates into the fact that even though the vote share, the vote patterns are not directly affecting the regional growth patterns in the Turkish economy and the overall territory, it seems that there is a backdoor which seems to be working on the indirect effect of the public expenditure. Of course, I'm not talking about the potential different mechanisms here, because, once you talk about distributed politics, we know that there are, the swing and stronghold hypothesis, but overall, this is what I end up, and the two findings. First, there is a geography of discontent. Second, I believe the GDP is aware of it, and there is some sort of distributed policy working on, and its effect on economic growth could be not directly visible, but it could be working over an indirect backdoor channel. Thanks for your time, and I hope I did not exceed too much of my time. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Jan, for a very nice presentation. Questions coming from anyone in the audience? Don't disappear.
I have a question. My question is, so if the lack of economic growth that drives the populism, right? And the support for that particular party, which is considered the populist party.
Mm-hmm.
And on the other hand, we see that once they are in power, so they give those regions some public support, right? That drives economic growth, right? So that means that in the next election, if those regions, so once they receive the government support, so they are growing. So what we should expect for the next election? So those regions we are supporting, so that particular part because of lack of economic growth. But once they are exposed to such huge government support in the next period, they are slightly developed, right? And then they should change their political preferences, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what's happening in the long run?
So that's a good question. This is something that we have been discussing with Andres as well. So my point here is that, we are only talking about at the moment the regions that are strongly voting for the GDP. So since they receive like public funds, they got developed, or their well-being increases at the end. So they would expect maybe something else, which is at the moment unobservable. But at the same time, there is another set of regions which we haven't told so far, which is not receiving the public funds. So they are probably going to create another, discontent, but we don't see the ballot box. my explanation to your, this remark is that it could be a cause for the consolidation of the power, because this first election we are talking about here in the 2002, we are talking about the overall vote share about 34%. But when we come to the coming elections around 2007 and 2011, we are talking about something above 40%. So that could be related with the consolidation, right? But I have to highlight that, something that I have to do, which I start doing, but I could not be on time on this. I need to look at this period-wise, right? Because I start with the second analysis with only the 2002 elections. But you are right to, if I replicate this with the 2007 elections and then try to see the periodical growth between, let's say, 2007 and 2015, that might be answering your question to see really once they receive the fund, how they behave. Because the perspective that I construct here is, very long-termist, and it gives us an overall idea, but it does not get to the details of the story. And that's particularly a good point. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you so much. I have just a very simple question regarding the first part. Do you think that the economic decline is a good measure to understand these places that are left behind in Turkey? Because it makes sense for the developed countries, that maybe we can talk about this economic decline or the industrialization process, but in some developing countries, it's different, the situation. So maybe it's more into like long-standing, marginalization more than economic decline. So I'm not sure about the situation of Turkey. That's why I'm asking you. And I have another question about the second part. I don't know if you mentioned if these are funds like non-programmatic funds or programmatic funds. There are like clear rules to distribute these funds.
Conditional or no conditional?
Yeah, because this is like the big question. If we are talking about the political, or the corruption of these kind of funds, for political purposes. So it may be interesting to test this idea with both, with the programmatic or non-programmatic funds.
Allow me to answer from the second question. Start with the second question, because that's my fault, because I forgot to mention that I'm talking about in this first set of analysis. These are the public expenditure in the education. We have like a functional distribution and also like sectoral distribution of some, not all, but some of the public expenditures. And what I did at the beginning is about the education. Overall, there is this social and economic development index in Turkey. So it's used to be produced by state planning organization years ago, but then state planning organization is no longer in effect. Now there are, other like institutions in Turkey dealing with this. And basically, of course, the public funds, the priority of the distribution is based on this. And there is also regional incentive acts that are going to be effective here. But since we are looking on the overall distribution, it's rather difficult to be able to distinguish directly the conditionality and the unconditionality. So that's the one issue.
Maybe you
guys, we're going to have to stop it there, because otherwise we don't get into your presentation, for example. But just one quick question, Jan. Are we then in dire straits? Because the general view is that if you suffer long-term economic decline, you don't believe anymore in the system, and then you vote for the likes of Donald Trump, or in this case, Erdogan, and they are going to deliver worse performance. And therefore, you're not going to be discontented, but they're not going to solve the problem. So the populism leads to worse outcomes. What you have is a long-term effect. So decline leads to populism, but then populism, in contrast to what everyone's saying, in the case of Turkey, delivers, because it uses money to promote economic growth, investment to promote growth, but it doesn't find works. It's a bit like exactly in the long term. We've seen that AKP or JDP has become far more authoritarian, especially since 2012. Does this situation stand now as it stood in the 2000s, or is it changing?
That's a good question. From my perspective, examining the same framework for the post-2000 calls for something else. Because, as you said, I mean, the post-2000 is a bit different in terms of the behavior of the GDP as well, because it started by like being about more democratic and more closer to right, the center right, let's say, but then it starts to become more authoritarian. And even though it used this distribution policy politics and I mean heavily invested in some of the lagging regions, I'm not sure because I mean I have been talking about these very isolated regions. So for some period of time there is a distribution there as well, but it didn't buy out votes. So it turns out that after 2000, the behavior of the voters could be a bit different compared to what we have seen in the pre-2001. Because, I mean, don't forget, if we go to the first slide, it is always a reshuffling within the ideology. It's not a reaction that voters are moving toward left-wing ideologies or right-wing ideologies because of the discontent. So it's like a reshuffling within the right wing. And the right wing, in that sense, is collapsed. That's why I'm saying that a political polarization. There is one side, we have AKP as the far-right political party, and the main opposition party is the People's Republican Party, which is the left-wing political party. And historically, when we look at the left votes in Turkey, you'll see that, I mean, especially during the multi-party period, it is always lagging behind the right-wing political ideologies. So in a way, it's a bit, I mean, difficult to directly say that, okay, it's going to be a wrong, the decline is going to put a reaction and it's going to create a discontent against the GDP votes at the moment.
Well, thank you very much, Jan. Now, without further ado, we'll move to Min Zhang, who is an associate professor at the Business School of Suzhou University in China. And she's going to be talking to the returns of private and public R&D investments at firm level, thus government institutional quality matter. Oh, I think I brought my my pointer. Go ahead.
Okay,
Min,
okay.
yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Andres, and thank you, everyone. The work I'm going to present is the ongoing work authored with Lexington from East China University of Science and Technology. So the research topic of our paper is about the effectiveness of R&D investment from by public sector. So we know that we human beings have benefit or not from innovation, which in most cases is the result of our purpose investment in R&D. Well, we can, but not only human beings benefit from R&D, the investors of R&D also benefit or not from R&D. That's why, you know, for example, for in the case of China, we know that for example, in 2022, we see that most of the R&D investments is sourced from business sector, which means that most of the, you know, that business sectors, they pursue for profit-making activities. So this means that R&D activities can bring about lots of returns to the investors. But we can also see that the government still take her part in R&D investment. It accounts for about 13%. Well, in the UK, it's about 7%. So if the question is that if the market can do very well in investing in R&D, why would we need the government to invest in R&D? It is worthwhile for government investment in R&D, especially, you know, government's funding. One part of government's expenditures goes to the research councils, to the higher educational institutions, and also a very big part goes to sponsor business R&Ds. So the question is about the government sponsor business R&D. Actually, in the literature, there are two different answers, and the one stand of literature they think it is very necessary for the government to sponsor business R&D. Why? For example, according to the market failure theory, R&D activities they exert positive externalities that government should to remedy the private R&D activities, and also by supporting business R&D, it will also indirect help private sectors to get external financial support from the market. But also some literature, they say, actually, there is no need for government to sponsor business R&D. Why? Because government's investment in R&D will crowd out private investment in R&D. And it will, because the first step, if the government decide to sponsor private R&D, it has to select the most promising firms with great innovation potentials. But it's not always that government's funding can go to the most promising firms. If the funding goes to the less competitive and less innovative firms, it will reduce resource mislocation, risk effects. Because government's money came from taxpayers. We taxpayers need to ensure that the government spends money on where it matters most, correct? So there's an argument. So I'd like to introduce what we have found in our research. The answer for the question, should the government sponsor business R&D? Our answer is, it depends on which type of innovation the private R&D is target. We find that actually we focus in the second stage. It means that after the firm has got the government fund, and we find that the government R&D funds has a lower return on product innovation, but has a higher income in innovation related to basic research-oriented knowledge innovation. And we also find the returns of private and public R&D is affected by the quality of local government institutions. In our world, in places with better government institutions, the return gap between private and public sectors in producing certain type of innovation outcome is broadened. It means that their difference is more clear in places with better government institutions. And we think we have contributed to the literature, because previous literature, they also assess the effectiveness of public investments, but their comparison is mostly conducted between different performers. For example, between the government, the firms, and the higher educational institutes. Actually, our comparison is conducted within the same firm. It means that all the other things are the same. The only difference is the origin of the fund. And we also reveal how and whether government institutional quality affects the returns of private and public R&D at firm level. So we will go. This is empirical results. So the advantage of our data set, we have firm level data. We have more than 15,000 manufacturing firms which has at least one type of innovation outcome during the study period between 2011 and 2013. And the advantage of our database is that we have different measurements of innovation, not only patenting activities, patenting outcome, but also we have new product sales revenues. And we know that the number of registered trademarks and the incomes from patent ownership, transfer, and licensing. And we also have the outcome of scientific publications. So before this research, we have first posed, that because the objective is the firm, we think that, firms, they are more profit driven. So if they have choices, they prefer to put their R&D investment to go for probably applied research that will generate more, for example, product sales revenue that will give lots of commercial benefits in very short time. But for example, they made less interested in for example, patents, in obtaining patents or scientific publications, because they are less valuable for them. So so we will distinguish different types of innovation outcome when we make the comparison. And how do we measure R&D investments? Actually, in our database, we have three sources. We have three indicators of R&D investments. First one is the R&D expenditures sponsored by the firm itself for its own program. And the second one is actually the firms may outsource some of their programs to external units, in most cases, the research institutes to do research, but the firm has to pay for it. But those money are sourced from the firms, so we call it private R&D. And in the data set, we also can recognize how much research, how much R&D fund the firm has got from the government. So we call that part is public R&D. And to measure government institutional quality, we use data from World Bank, enterprises survey unit, and it covers only 25 largest cities in China, which we can see most of them are distributed in the relatively developed regions in China. And we generally first use the overall quality of government index to reflect the overall government institutional quality. And after that, we also decompose the quality of government index to use the sub-indicators to show how the government institutional quality reflects the terms of government of R&D investments. And here, how can we recognize the differences in returns of private and public sectors? For example, in model one, is a kilometric linear model. By comparing the significance and the magnitude of coefficient, beta 1, beta 2, and beta 3, we can tell the difference. That's the strategy. And we also, in model 2, we add the interaction term to see how government institutional quality affect and moderate the impact of R&D investment. And here is the results. In table 1, we have 7 columns. We see in each column, the explanatory variables are the same. The only difference is the dependent variable. For example, in column 1, the dependent variable is new product sales. It's measuring product innovation. Here, by looking at the coefficients, we see that internal R&D, the outsourcing R&D and government R&D, the coefficients are both significant. But the difference is that the internal R&D has a higher coefficient magnitude, which is almost 6 times larger than that of the government R&D. So, and the same applies to the case when the dependent variable is the number of patents. So here we arrive one conclusion that that the internal R&D has a higher return in producing product innovation. But also, government R&D has its own advantage. For example, in producing producing patenting revenue, patenting revenue in most cases can reflect the quality of the patents. Sometimes the number of patents cannot reflect the value of the patents, but the patenting revenue can reflect. We find that government R&D has a higher reform. The same goes to the case when the outcome is trademark, number of trademarks, number of standards and articles. So I will. So next, the impact of government institutional quality. So why we care about government institutional quality? So the reason is that, especially when governments allocated resources, the decision itself matters, but the effectiveness of the system also matters. the outcome. So we care about this factor. So we find that quality of government index is significant when the innovation outcome is patenting innovation, is product innovation in column 1 and patenting innovation in column 3 and 4. So that's the conclusion. Government institutional quality matters. And we also the results with interaction terms. And we see that for example, the results are not, but I will try to make it simple. For example, in column 1, we see the quality of government index is significant, but the interaction term between government institutional quality and public R&D is negative. So we interpret it as in places with better government institutions, the return gap between private return and private R&D and public R&D is broadened. It means that in regions with good government institutional quality, actually the the firms have more comparative advantage in producing product innovation. And for example, in column 3, we find that column 3 about patenting innovation, we see in places with better government institutions, the return gap between private sector and the public sector is narrowed. Why? Because probably that is narrowed. There's another that's okay. I will this is probably because in places with good government institutions, it makes less differences about who is the innovators, firms or the government. The results do not make much difference. And we also introduce an instrument to be the instrument for quality of government index. We use a dummy variable indicating whether the city mayor is his or her age is below 55, because to the political literature, that in the case of China, the local officials, the probability to get promotion tends to be sharply decreased when they reach 55. Why? I don't think I have time to explain, but for officials who are below 55, they are more motivated to do institutional reform to improve government institutional quality because it matters his political performance. But for officers who are elder than 55, he knows that he has little opportunity to get promoted, so he makes less efforts. He tends to make less efforts to improve institutional quality. So that's the rationality of the instruments. And also we see the results is also as expected. And we also decompose the government institutional quality. We see that in most cases the sub-indicators are positive, which means better government institutional quality, better government institutional sub-items, larger R&D returns, except the case of control of corruption. This is probably because the Chinese system is not mature enough that firms has to get what they want through corruption. We also do heterogeneity analysis, but I will jump that. So the implication is that the answer is it depends. If the budget is limited, government budget is limited, and the government should reduce the support for product innovation and increase the support for knowledge innovation. That's the simple story from my research. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions? Please go ahead. Your name is?
Anna.
Anna.
Thank you. Well, I'm not from this field, so maybe this question is very off topic, so apologies in advance if that's the case. But when you were presenting the motivation, you were saying how because the government investment is goes from taxes, it should be targeted, but sometimes from the government it's expected to not target something that is going to be efficient, but rather something that is maybe inefficient but socially a socially desirable outcome. So I was wondering if maybe you have data on other indicators that can capture these kind of inefficient but not socially desirable outcomes and maybe use them as a dependent variable for robustness checks.
Yes, I think I can probably answer your question. Actually, the results can answer your questions. Actually the returns of government's R&D is higher in basic knowledge oriented innovation. For example, scientific applications, that's less beneficiary to the firms, but has a higher, social, but its benefit to the society. It helps firms to do applied research because the basic knowledge can, not of research is drawn from the basic research, and also, for example, patenting. The firms they care less about this part. So my conclusion is also about that government should support more about knowledge innovation that supports basic research that, as you said, benefits the society, not so firms for commercial use.
Thank you.
Yeah, you had a question? Yes.
Yeah, it's super interesting. Thank you, Min. I just wanted to ask, can you say a bit more about how research funds get allocated? So who allocates them and specifically for what purpose?
Yeah, our research is only focused in the second stage. Lots of scholars, they assess the effectiveness of government R&D. For example, in the first stage, is the government funding goes to the right firms or not? The effectiveness of the assigning, but this is not the topic in this research. We only care. We know that my question is, after the firm has obtained the fund, if the government fund has the same return of the firm funded, or is higher than firms funded. If the returns is no less than the firm funded, we say it's worthwhile, or we say even the firms have got funded from the government. That the government funding still has a lower firm than firm affected as themselves. So your question is very important, but it's beyond our research. Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, I had a question. So if you have this firm level data set, right, and those grants are targeted to some specific firms, right? And
yeah.
I imagine that there should be some kind of negative selection because governments should provide support that those firms that are not performing very well.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why the return on the investment is lower for government investments. So simply because of that negative selection. So if you allocate money to those firms, so let's imagine that, so we don't have any kind of the political misalignment and the political connection story. If the government wants to support some of the firms, some of the industries, so they target those firms that are not performing really well. And then once you compare firms with internal, the R&D, and the firms with government R&D, so the government, the R&D firms, they are selectively less efficient using that investment. And that's why you have this kind of the gap, because internal R&Ds, those are the already successful firms, so they have internal fund to finance their own innovation. That's why the return on investment is higher compared to firms with government support. Yeah, it's just a comment. So not just
our data set, we cannot answer whether the grant has been granted to the correct firms.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
I think one factor we have to take into our consideration is the government institutional quality. We think probably there is a positive link. For example, if the government institutions are more effective, for example, with less corruption, I think there is a higher likelihood that the grant, that the fund is granted to the correct, the right firms. That's why we take government institutional quality into our.
So have you tried the?
Let's just move, because otherwise we don't have time for Pedro, who's the last one. Just one quick thing. All your interactions are negative and significant. I mean, I buy your argument. The argument is very clear. It's good. It's what I think should be how we should invest in terms of research and development, and how should public funding would do. But when it goes to your interaction between quality of government and different types of investment, where it is private R&D or government R&D or university, higher education R&D, they're all negative and significant when they are significant. How do we interpret that? Is it that, well, it doesn't really make that much of a difference, or if it makes, if anything, better institutions actually undermine the effect of investment? Or should we interpret in a way in which, well, the most advanced firms and regions don't need any more investment? You should channel that investment to areas with poorer, with weaker quality of government or quality of institutions.
Yeah, it is. I think you get the point. Is actually the result is out of our expectation. We expect it to be positive. Yes, but we try to interpret it. You know that when the government institutions, we interpret it. I'm not sure that I'm interpret it correct or not, but I try to interpret it as, you know, when the doing business environment is better, you know, by improvement of government institutional quality. The firms compete with each other. Government, you know, firms has a higher, you know, comparative advantage in the market. They are more competitive. So in this case, the returns of the government, they cannot compete with the firms, you know, in achieving new product revenues. Most of the opportunities are limited. When the opportunities are grasped by the firms, so we can understand that firms have less opportunity to succeed in getting the innovation.
Okay, thank you very much, Min. Before we move on, well, first, recommendation to both Jan and Min in terms of presentation and what you should do. My advice is always know your audience. I mean, I'm giving a lot of talks these days to non-specialists, and you've done the presentation as if all the audience were economists, which a lot of tables, which is good, but sometimes when you are tackling, and like this one, a multidisciplinary audience, not everyone's an economist, not everyone has the same background in terms of, maybe you might want to put one or two tables, but then highlight and put the emphasis on what are the results and what is the message that comes out. Because you're trying to demonstrate too much. When you have 15 minutes, perhaps it's not the time to demonstrate, it's the time to actually, on the basis of your results, convince us. And especially when you are targeting a broader audience than just a pure, let's say, academic seminar, which is what you have conducted, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it's probably know your audience is my recommendation. Thank you very much. Now we're moving from economic geography to economic history. And we have Giacomo Rella, who is from the University of Roma Tre, and he's also the GC Wealth Project at Stone Center on Socioeconomic Inequality at CUNY, which is the State University, City University of New York. There, and paper apparently is with Clara, who is also going to be presenting later, and it's a balancing act, local fiscal resilience after, I suppose, it's market closures, or no, mine closures, So, all right.
Thank you. Thank you. So thank you for being here and for the opportunity to present your work in progress, which is with Clara Dallaire-Fortier, who is also a fellow here. So the main motivation for this work is between the fact of climate events on local economies and the mediating role that the local governments can have. We know that climate events are getting intensified and that their effects are localized. At the same time, we know that mitigation policies and decarbonization efforts will involve the downscaling of extractive and fossil fuel activities. So we would expect that mitigation policies will lead to industrial transformation, and in particular to deindustrialization, which can have uneven geographical impacts. With this paper, we ask what is the role of local governments, in particular municipalities, in these dynamics? Do they act as shock absorbers or as shock amplifiers? And we also ask whether the current administrative and fiscal structure of municipalities is resilient to this type of industrial shocks. We were surprised to see that given the effort in practice to transitioning away from a brown economy toward a green economy, there is much less research on how municipalities are going to be affected by this type of shocks. And therefore, we think that looking at the municipal response of industrial downscaling remains urgent. Narrowing down more on this paper, the research questions that we ask are two. So the first is how does the downscaling of natural resource sector affect the capacity of local government to raise revenues and to spend the money on the provision of local public services? And also we wonder how the effects of industrial shocks are distributed across the municipal budget. At the beginning of the talk, I talked about downscaling of natural resources. What we observe in our paper is, in particular, the shutting down of mines. Shutting down of mines in Canada, in particular in the region of Northern Ontario. We think that this can be a good laboratory to see and to inspect the resilience of local governments to this type of industrial shocks, because mining activity is mostly driven by the demand, the foreign demand, and in particular by the fluctuation in commodity prices. And for these municipalities in Northern Ontario, which is an historical mining region in Canada, most of the time, these municipalities are isolated. This is because of the very nature of the mining activity. And they also operate in a mono-industrial fashion. Most of the time, the municipalities have been founded because there was some mineral to extract there. And a lot of infrastructures have been inherited by the mine over time. Of course, there's an economy that creates around the mining activity, but still the mine remains the most important business in town. And we reference to three types of literature. The first is the one on large layoffs, which are associated with industrial closure, and also the literature on the impact of natural resource sectors, boom and bust on government finance, and the resilience of public finance to climate shocks. As we see, these are three, self-autonomous, three separated literature, and with this paper we try to be across these three literature. So let's start with some background. This is how a mining town may look like in Northern Ontario. We're here in Timmins. So we see that really the city is built around the production side. And the mining sector in Ontario is quite important. Although Ontario is a very diversified economy, the mining sector is an important one. And in particular, the mineral production in Ontario is 24% of the national production using 2020 data. More than 19,000 workers are employed directly by the mining sector, so without considering all the induced and indirect industry around. The average weekly wages are higher in the mining sector than in any other sector. And as we see, about 63% of employees in the mining companies resides in Northern Ontario. And this is where we are going to look at with our paper. The taxation of mines, in particular remote mines, is mines are subject to the corporate income tax, but also to another tax called the mining tax, which operates at the provincial level. And the reason why we are, let's say, highlighting this fact is that we expect the mining activity to affect the municipal budget only indirectly, so through the economic multiplier associated with mining activity. The municipalities in Ontario are those among all the other municipalities in the country that are responsible for providing community and social services. Here we see a chart where we compare the per capita expenses across municipalities in all provinces of Ontario. And we see that this yellow bar is highest for Ontario, which suggests that social spending, most of social spending is done by municipalities in Ontario. And this is why we look at, this is also why we look at Ontario, because the municipalities have some autonomy over the source of revenues and expenses. In terms of data, we use two sources. The first one is MinCan, which is a mine level data set that my co-author Clara created by digitizing historical geological maps. And the second one is the Ontario Financial Information Return, which is a form that every municipality every year at the end of the fiscal year has to fill, which they report expenses, revenues, and all municipal financial information. So we merge these two data sets by checking by assigning mine closures for which you observe geographical location to the municipality. And we focus on single-tier municipalities, which are those municipalities in Ontario that are responsible for providing autonomously public services. And we split the group into a treated and control group. And our treated units are going to be municipalities that have experienced one mine closure between 2001 and 2022. And the controls are all other municipalities in the north of Ontario. So we go to look where we focus our attention, where we expect the effect to be the largest, because the northern Ontario is a very isolated part of the province where most of the time mining is the most important economic activity. And in this chart, we can see the composition of revenues and expenses. We see in the revenues, for example, that the property tax is the most important component of the revenues, followed by conditional grants and unconditional grants. Conditional grants are grants given by municipalities based on most of the time, infrastructural projects, while unconditional grants are given per capita, and they allows municipalities that have problems in raising revenues, for example, from the property tax, in increasing the revenue base. And then there is user fees or charges, which will be an important role in our analysis. This is instead the composition of expenses. We see that transportation services is a very important aspect, but also that social and family services, social housing, and health services, also this is social spending, is a non-negligible part of expenses. So let's go to the methodology. We use, try to go fast here, but basically we have municipalities that experience the closures, municipalities that do not. So what we want to do is that we want to compare how some elements of the budget, some items of the budget are evolved in municipalities that have experienced the closure with those municipalities that did not. So we use a so-called local projection difference in difference methodology. We built on a recent literature that shows that traditional event studies can be biased when the shock takes time or when the effects of the shocks are evolve over time, and which is the case for mine closure. So we basically, this is the model. We regress the difference in the outcome on the treatment indicator and some controls, and we split the sample into treated municipalities and controls, which are these municipalities that didn't have any closure. So the results. So this is here we plot the estimates. We have the blue is the revenues, aggregate revenues, and the red is expenses. So we see that first of all we see that there is we see from 3 years before the closure to 12 years after the closure. So it's quite a long span. So we see that both revenues and expenses initially decreases after the closure, but then increases. And we also see that the difference between the changes in revenues and expenses is not that big, which suggests that actually mine closures do not lead to large imbalances, at least when we look at the aggregate revenues and expenses. But the mine closure leads to quite important reconfiguration of expenses and revenues. So here we look at revenues, 4 categories. We look at the property tax and conditional grants, user fees and charges and licenses. We see that the revenues from property tax increases. This is very unexpected for us because if the mine closure has some economic effect, this should appear into the valuation of housing, so in house prices. However, in Ontario, the tax base on which the property tax is calculated is not does not reflect market value, but there is an agency that re-updates the value every 4 years. So this calls for some, we are cautious in interpreting this result. However, what we see is that unconditional grants fall after the mine closes. And it's likely that because that municipalities are losing one source of revenue, that is unconditional grants, they increase the price of the public services to their citizens. This would explain why, although with a lag, user fees and charges increase quite persistently over time. The last chart, licensing permits and rents, suggests us that actually mine closures have non-negligible economic effects at the local level. In particular, the revenue from licenses shrinks. This suggests we think that this is because the economy is shrinking too, because an important source of income is missing, which is the wages from the mine. On the expenses side, we have very different results, very heterogeneous results. What we perceive that there is a reconfiguration in expenses. So we see that government and transport services initially decreases, but then increase, but there are quite strong pre-trends, which we are studying. And the protection services initially do not respond. These are, expenses for fire, police, which makes sense. This is a fixed cost for municipalities. But because we know that actually 10 years after the closure, the population in the municipality decreases, this would suggest that, once population starts to, there is a depopulation, also those fixed costs maybe are start to get cut. On the second row, we have social spending, so social housing, health, and social services. We perceive an initial decrease followed by a decrease, and which suggests that there is a demand for social spending after the mine closure. That in some cases it's accommodated by the municipalities. So the concluding remarks is that the mine closure leads to some configuration of the municipal budget. I think I was clear enough, so I will not repeat the results. And the next step, we are going to inspect the mechanism using maybe census data or qualitative evidence with the interviews. And we also want to clean the effect from the fact that there is now a demand for critical materials because of decarbonization. So we want to tease out this. And so that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Questions?
Can I have a short question? I mean, just to clarify, your treatment, it's like if there is a mine, only one mine closure, right? At least one mine closure.
Yeah, one mine closure.
Okay, I mean, these municipalities are really very small, but do you have any idea what control you check if there are remaining mines there, or do you only have one mines per municipality?
No, these are only one mine closure.
So if there is a closure, there is no longer any mining activity though. So you're sure on that?
No, there are cases. That's why there are cases of mines that can reopen much later, but not the same mine. This is why we want to take this effect out in the future.
Okay. So maybe I mean, I'm not sure, but you were showing that some of the effects are non-linear, right? So there are
Yeah.
different waves.
Yeah, maybe there's
Could
some
be-
regularity, whether it's the.
Because it's
the
quite
only mind
interesting,
that exists. Yeah.
It's quite, I just wonder if there's something remaining there.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Any other questions?
I can comment. So I find this super interesting, largely because I have a very similar paper that is not on mines. And what I was gonna say is that I think you need to fix your pre-trends for a bunch of the outcomes because, well, you know. So I was wondering why you were using Chesma San Dots Foy and not San and Abram, for example, but now if you say that it turns on and off. But this is just a methodological thing. I would try to compare estimators to see if your parallel trends are better, because some of the things I was like, I don't know if that's there or
Yeah.
not.
I completely agree that the only problem is that for some of these papers that you mentioned, they were getting the parallel trends wrong because they were not like the parallel trend is just like the yearly change in this case and not like the 2-year, 3-year change. This was like recently showed.
Yeah.
And but yeah, we look with other because there are strong parallel trends. Some of them are part of the story because, for example, the grants are given based on population. These are towns that are anyway depopulating over time. So, but we have to figure out
How to fix it? No, I know that this is challenging. Maybe making the period longer would also help, because even
Yeah,
if they
well-
go off a little bit, but you see that it's roughly in the same.
Yeah. Thank
Yeah,
you.
we'll talk about this later.
Yeah.
Any other questions? I don't know. All right, so my question is regarding, you're looking at the budget of municipal budgets. And what I was surprised, these are places where the main source of revenue, the mine is closing, and rather than having seen a decline in let's say the budget at the local level, what we see is very often an increase. Is it just a pure effect of subsidies by, in this case, the Ontario government or the government of Canada to actually maintain the community there? Or is it because also some areas and some these communities are using the mine closure to try new things and try to promote any other sort of economic development?
So it can be both at the moment, because we observed that I didn't put the result, but the conditional grants, so for example, the municipality applies for a project, they kind of go up and then down. So maybe there are some, for sure there is some heterogeneity across the treated municipalities. Because for some, for example, there is another mine opening further into the future that, you know, like offset this partially the closure. So there is this heterogeneity. I think it can be both. And I would say that both are now in the results. And we should try to like exploit this heterogeneity to see, okay, which are the municipalities that, you know, are, let's say, utilizing versus those that are then maybe applying, changing.
Well, thank you very much, Giacomo. Now we go to our second paper on economic history, which is by Clara Fortier from Lund University, which is on provisioning in ghost towns, the mediating effect of social policies after mine closure. So we stick to mines at the moment.
Yeah, so thank you, Giacomo, for introducing our common paper, but also for making a very clear introduction to what I'm going to talk about right now. So I can skip all the motivation part almost. But basically, the previous paper was in my doctoral project, and what I'm going to do now is give you a little overview of what I did and kind of have my existential crisis about the next step with you. So what I did is the part that is above. So I did first an analysis of the history of this mining industry in Canada. And then I created this database that Giacomo mentioned to be able to produce these two papers. So the fourth one is the one that Giacomo just presented, and the third one is one that I'm going to present really briefly about the impact it has on the labor force. So the impact of a mine closure on the labor force. So with this quantitative assessment of the phenomena, there is kind of, okay, the situation is a bit doomed, but what are the solution question that remains? And that's what I'm gonna try to do with this last article, using a bit more qualitative data by doing interview. And why I'm gonna present all the other things is because I don't have much results because I'm going to do the fieldwork next month. So it's an occasion for me to receive feedback on the general project. So the first article was really this history of mining in Canada. What I do is that I use a framework from the Regulation School. It's a French economic school that presents the history of economics as periods of regimes, so periods of stability intertwined by crises. So what I'm doing is that I use this framework to talk about the industry of mining in Canada. In the first regime, what I can observe is that it's a very nascent regime, nascent industry. It's still quite artisanal, and it's the formation of the institution that will then shape, and until today shaped quite a lot the industry. So speculation is very important, and it still is today. And the free mining principle, so the legal framework that is used is very important, and it gives primacy to mining companies. The second regime is when it booms. So the industry booms now, there's the acquisition of better technology, and the government will decide to use it as a national development plan. A lot of money will be put in the industry, and a lot of valorization of the industry will be solidified in that period, in that the second regime. This will be challenged by the fact that the actual size of the labor force gets into a decline during the third regime, when a lot of labor will be substituted by machines, but also there will be a couple of big closures that will change a bit the landscape of mining in Canada. Then so we have closures of big towns. So these are some of the cases that kind of generate this idea that mining leads to ghost town. There is this despair that is associated to the industry. So linked to that, there's a need to redefine the legitimacy of the industry, especially because there will be an upswing in prices. So there will be a lot of investment made in Canada. And during the last regime, what we will see is that there is this need to have a new discourse that will emerge about sustainable mining and multi-stakeholder participation. And this will be interesting into what we do about this town, because if there is this willingness to think about how to have a social and environmental corporate responsibility, how exactly can it be done, remains the question to answer. The third paper in my PhD, what I'm looking at, it's at the labor, so the impact of the closure on different segments of the labor force. So I'm looking at direct employment. These are the employment in the mining industry. Indirect employment, so those are related industries through backward and forward linkages. So for example, construction or transport. And I'm looking at induced employment. So these would be local services that are kind of linked through consumption linkage, which would be that these people consume things locally, and then they have a demand for different service. When we look at direct employment, using the same method that Giacomo just described, what we have is a direct decline, so a clear shock on that share of the employment of the local labor force. When we look at indirect employment, we see that it stagnates and then it declines, which indicate that there's a little bit of a lag in the impact, which means that the full impact of a mine closure is really felt a little bit later. So there is a 5-year delay before other kind of jobs get also cut strongly. And when we look at induced employment, there's quite some fluctuation, but generally it's in the negative, which raise a couple of questions that my paper do not answer, but we see that it's a lot of the shock is also in those part of the labor force. Also, when we look in general term, these are the biggest share of employment in the region. So it means that these fluctuations actually have an impact on a lot of people. So that leads us with the question of what we do with this. So we have a situation of a historical vulnerability of the mining region to boom and bust, large structural impact on the local economy. And on the other side, we also have the emergence of a new corporate discourse on sustainable mining and the adoption of new regulation in Ontario and in the rest of Canada that makes mine closure plans mandatory. So it seems to be that there is an interest on managing that negative impact. But how exactly is that going to be operated? It's a little bit the question that I'm trying to ask with this last paper. So I'm focusing on the same region Giacomo described, so Northern Ontario. And really, yeah, the objective is to assess to which extent and into which way the policies they address the structural obstacles faced by the mining community after the closure. What I'm going to do is to look into getting some sort of insights from the two different type of literature. The first one is the resource curse. So that's exactly which mechanism induced the sort of decline in the regions. And it's the classic perspective on resource dependency. And the second one, known to everyone here, is the left behind places literature. So what I think brings to the conversation this literature is the regional and rural isolation from economic and state processes, but also a critical perspective within economic geography. And what am I going to do? So the first that is free is a report analysis. So I read many closure plans. I got a certain familiarity with what the corporate sort of objectives are, but also best practice guides. And so how is it that they want to manage this closure? And that is very important because we need to understand what they propose, but also because it's quite difficult to interview mining companies. They don't always accept interview. So I really wanted to bring the perspective and that's a way to do it. And so then what I'm going to do next month is to go and interview many people in those community. And I want two perspectives. I want the town perspective and the policy perspective. And to do that, there's different sets of stakeholders. And why I want the town perspective is that there is a lot of lived experience that add a lot of texture into our understanding of what this decline means. And that can really, go into explaining why some of the mechanism functions well, some might not function as well. And then the policy perspective is really to understand a little bit more the rationale behind these the policies and the type of intervention. I do have some preliminary findings. First is that when we look at mine closure plans, they are quite ambitious in the type of statement that they have. They do want to do fantastic things about the social impacts. But when it comes to how to operationalize that, they do not have clear guides. They do not have clear step-by-step type of information, where they do have it a lot when it comes to the environmental impact. So they will detail the exact type of rock management of the stream of that river that is there, but they will not say what it means to reduce the social impact of a mine closure. Although the sort of ambitions are often twofolded. They do include equally both the social and economic aspect and the environmental aspect. And what I could also find is that legally, there are some ways in which they do not have, they can avoid their responsibilities. Other preliminary findings, because I did a few interviews also. So linked to a bit their perspective is that what they say, there's these multiple downward cycles linked to the mono-industrial structure and to fiscal channels that further isolate the region in the process of development. So the fact that they are so far away, it makes it quite difficult for them to be attractive to different types of industries. And they try to identify how this could be done. Is there old train tracks from the mine that could be used? Is there some sort of ways that they can be attractive? But most of the time they say it's quite difficult to try to attract companies here. Then there is a strong feeling of pride of the region, strong feeling of entrepreneurship, but that affects really much the local level and not necessarily in a financial way. So people are are said to be very innovative, very collaborative, in a way that in economic term could result into kind of industrial dynamism. But without this further aspect of like being attractive to other industries, it's very quite difficult for this to concretize into a sustainable economy. Then there is also this aspect that retraining programs or other type of solutions that are usually proposed do fail in the fact that there is very little job of supply, which means that even if you get retraining, you don't necessarily have that much with what you do, which leads to further out mobility. So in a way, what is the right policy response? It would need to both address the structural level and the negative downward cycles and some of the power balances of how money would be distributed over the whole province. So the next step is these interviews that I mentioned. And what I'm going to try to identify is what are the possible solution spaces. And I'm kind of putting it there because I also would be happy to have your opinions on the type of questions, the type of direction I should give to the interviews, according to your own knowledge of this left behind literature. I have a set of questions, don't worry, I don't go unprepared, but I would really like to have your feedback on this.
Okay, thank you very much, Claire. Questions? Suggestions to Clara for her interviews? Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I think that one of the kind of interesting idea to see this kind of household surveys. Yeah, for example, in Europe, there is a European social surveys, and they ask quite interesting questions in so many different dimensions, like social, political preferences, and so on. And if you have something like that, so in Canada, so to look at the before the event and the after the event, how the people's preferences changes, because it's kind of the trade-off between having a job and also the, I don't know, the care about the environment and the social aspect, and how the preferences change after the event. So that can be useful, and also that might simplify your data collection, because those surveys have been done already, right? And I have never done this interview myself, so I have kind of no suggestion at the moment. But yeah, so looking at the household surveys, that can be kind of interesting. Information.
What else, Victor?
Yeah, but I need to make sure that there's only one mine closure in your sample, correct?
So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to be based in Timmins, and around that there are 8 mine towns where there are some cases of closures within reach. So I'm going to spend quite some time there and be able to access, but I'm going to focus on 3 towns.
Okay, because if the closure is very rare, I think probably my question is not very related to research question, but I think one solution, because nowadays we are talking about recycling economy. Probably we can, is that possible that we turn the, closure into some tourist site, because, it happens in history and it's very rare. Probably people are very interested in, how the mining work used to be. So probably, can refine the value of the this event.
It's interesting. I think they tried also to do that a lot in the Appalachia, where there were the coal region. I think that in this case, the further difficulty is that it actually will take me 12 hours to drive nonstop to go to that region.
Okay.
So it's not particularly accessible by car. And even a lot of the miners, what they do is that they fly to the site of the mine.
Okay, I see.
So it's a little bit difficult for that solution to work well. What some of the town have managed to recycle in is actually because eventually the price of the houses decline so much that it becomes advantageous to buy a house there. And there is actually one town that was the one that was on one of the first slide. That was this famous case of a ghost town that now is actually becoming slowly a retiree place. So because the houses are cheaper, people move there to retire. But there is a few like success recycling examples.
Yes, Victor?
Yeah, well, I'll try to be short because there are more questions, but I have a question. I don't know if it's relevant to you or not, and also to Giacomo, because you are looking at mine closures, which I don't know what specific reason for the closure is, but I'm guessing it's not that the mineral finished, but something else happened. So I will push you to look into mines that were about to close and didn't close at the end, because of maybe some cooperation with the workers or some decrease in the production, artificial decrease in the production, but still continuing the mine. Some alternative consequences for like comparable mine sites or comparable towns that didn't end up in closures.
Yes. Heather?
No, I can just give the feedback after, no problem.
Okay, Anna?
Okay, yeah, I had a quick question. You probably, maybe you've already looked at it. I was wondering if maybe in the service you can also ask about if they had a job before the mining sector, if they were working on something else, because maybe there's some propagation, because I don't know, maybe if they had restaurants and stuff, and now there's a lot of people who moved out, they cannot open a restaurant again. So I was wondering if there are more layers too.
Yeah. Whether they tried in different industries and whether they know.
Yeah, I see, like if before they were working, before joining the mining, they had something else, but they cannot come back to it because of.
Yeah, thank you so
much. Yes, Clara, a very nice presentation. And I think it's a very interesting research, but you're highlighting one thing that we used to call corporate social responsibility, which I'm not sure still called in the same way, in which you have mines that are closing for whatever reason, in communities that are highly dependent, because you mentioned the people that fly to the mines, but I suppose this is not like in Australia. In the Pilbara, there's no population, and people fly from Victoria or fly from New South Wales or from Perth into the Pilbara. It's only men, mostly men, and there's no one living there on a permanent basis. And then they come and spend 4 or 5 weeks at home, and then they go back to the mine. So these are communities in general. First, my question would be, when you ask your questions, how sincere are the companies about doing something in terms of social and environmental sustainability when in the end, what they're doing is closing a mine that's not profitable and they're moving out? Is it just a damaged reputation, or are they sincere, or is it a legal requirement and they don't really care that much about the communities? And the second question would be on the other side, how realistic are the communities? Because everyone, either directly or indirectly, the restaurants and the hotels and the shops depend on the mine. How realistic are they about their own perspectives, and how hands-on are they doing? Are they becoming proactive in terms of trying to find solutions with the help of the mining company or the government or alone? Or are they just passive recipients and saying, let's hope we get something from the mine or from the government?
On the first question, yes, we have to be skeptical of how kind of a corporate washing that is, especially because the narrative on sustainable mining emerged a lot in Canada and in Australia when there were very strong mobilization to prevent project to happen, both from the indigenous side and from the environmentalist side. And after a period where there was such a decline in employment that they say, but this is not like an employment generating industry. And it's true, it doesn't generate that many employment, very high paid, few employments. And so in a way, it's to maintain their certain reputation of the industry and ensure that they can have project and not put the risk of all the capital that they put in in seeing that project being closed. So we can be very cynical in that dynamic to actually not judge this. But what I'm thinking is that now that there is this big wave of critical mineral, it's a good moment to assess whether or not this discourse could be kind of ameliorated in the context of boom of extraction. On the second question on the community, they are absolutely not naive. I find them very smart in the way that they see things, but what they think is more, with the money that I make in the mine right now, I can pay for high education for my kids. So I'm gonna do it for as long as they want me to do it. And I'm gonna maybe fly to another region or relocate to another region to continue doing it as long as I can in order to provide for my children a better future than what I could access with my level of education. Which works for them as like this group of miners, but it doesn't work for a place-based vision of that region. Yeah, so, but also we see that there's not that much mobility. So a lot of the mainstream economics would say all of the people would out-migrate of the left behind regions, but it's not true. There are people that are core there that are leaving there, staying there. And that's a bit where I think this kind of place-based research becomes interesting into like, okay, if they are staying there, what can we do about it? But it's still a question that I have no answer to.
Okay, thank you very much, Clara. So now we move to the third and final block. So we have exactly Barbacadze. I hope I pronounced your name adequately.
Yes.
Who is from the Cambridge Judge Business School, and we're going back to populism here. Is our populist governments really pro-people and anti-elite? So the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. The topic for today's presentation is about populism and what the populist governments do once they are in power. So we know that the populism is growing in many countries. So the populist support and the political parties that received so much votes recently, and also the academic literature is growing in that regard. But once the literature is growing in terms of the drivers of the populist support, so the literature about the consequences of the populist government is relatively scarce. And there are some country-specific studies which talks about whether that particular political party, what kind of economic outcomes they have, but then there is no systematic kind of cross-country, so the multi-country setup in that direction. And more importantly, we do not know exactly what kind of policies they implement. We might have some ideas what kind of economic, so the consequences those populist transition might have, but we have we know very little what kind of exact, so the specific policies they implement to then leads to this kind of negative or positive economic consequences. And this paper addressed this question. So we study whether the populist transition, how that's affect the laws regarding the so the worker rights and also the shareholder rights. So we look at the workers and we look at the so the corporate governance, so the policies, right? So the reason why we are looking at the labor rights and labor regulations and also the shareholder rights, so that can be driven by two factors. The first one is so by simply the definition of populist, because so the populist in so the most known definition suggested by Mude is that so the populist government and the parties and the leader, they divide society into two different parts. So the antagonistic part, those are workers and the people, and the other ones are the elites. And the populist leaders, they define that they want to defend the interests of the people, so the against the elites, right? And if we're talking about the people and the elites, so the people in that case can be considered as the workers, and then so the populist governments want to secure their rights and provide them employment securities, and the elites in that case are shareholders, which are so their interests are growing in recent years. And the other one is that those two types of policies, so the labor regulation and corporate governance, that can be used and so they're manipulated by the populist government to achieve their political goals, right? So because every government, they are strategic, so they want to implement those type of policies that maintain their power, which is especially true for populist government because most of the time they promise something and sometimes they fail to deliver. So in that case, yeah, we'll kind of very briefly summarize the literature. So the paper by Funke, which is now published in the American Economic Review recently, 2023, that's a kind of wrong reference because it's a working paper reference. So that paper is a kind of now leading work in populism, which talks about the cost of populism, right? So, and then they study 60 countries, very long time. And so they identify that the cost of populism, so the economic cost of the populism is very high. And after 15 years, so the GDP, so the per capita dropped by 10% in those countries that experienced the populist transition. So that's kind of cross-country setup. So if we look at the individual countries, so the results are very, very mixed. If, for example, in Poland, so the economic effect of the populist government is strongly positive, and especially in the short run, because that paper, they study the GDP per capita as a measure of economic growth, and then they find that after the populist, so the government take over, so the GDP per capita increased by 8%. And then they also deliver some policies related to social benefits and also tax revenue increase as well. And for example, in the United States, there is no study which suggests that the Trump government was kind of the positive or negative. So they find kind of neutral effect. Maybe some aspects of the economy were kind of doing really fine. And some other one, for example, trade policy creates some negative, the consequences. So that's why we do not have a kind of strong support whether the Trump government was strictly negative. And also in the case of Turkey, so interesting is that during the Erdogan government, Turkey achieved economic growth, but those studies, so the Acemoglu study 2020, they consider that type of economic growth kind of low quality economic growth, because even though they achieved some sort of economic growth, that was coming from low productivity, rising inequality, and so on. And so the Italian case is interesting because the populism is associated with decreasing the quality of institutions, because there is a high turnover of the bureaucrats, and the level of education in the the public sector went down as well. So the country level evidence are quite mixed, and we do not know much about what happens in particular policies, right? So the previous slide was about the economy in general and the institutions in general. We do not know what kind of policies they actually implement, right? And there are some studies here, for example, about immigration policies, foreign policies, health policy, some sort of deregulation, economic policies, and those results are quite mixed, even though the populist government should have very strong immigration, the targets and also the kind of foreign policy, because they are against the foreign capital and so on. So we don't have this kind of really strong evidence of what's happening once they are in power. And also in terms of, for example, health policy during the COVID pandemic, some studies arguing that the populist government, they implemented the COVID measure than non-populist government, right? So this kind of, the motivation of the study is to look at these particular policies which I've never studied before, and those policies are labor regulation policies and the shareholder protection. So in that paper, we are using two main data sets. So the first one coming from the center which I'm working at the moment, so that the Center for Business Research at Judge Business School, and they collected information about the labor regulation from many countries, from starting from 1970 till very recently, and then they measure the level of labor regulation in each country. So they use the sort of text analysis to differentiated how protective is labor law in that particular country, that particular year, right? And then they differentiated, yeah, for example, 5 different categories of labor regulation. One is about the different forms of employment. The other one is about regulation of working time, regulation of dismissal, and then we have employee representation and industrial action. So we have the overall index of labor regulation, how protected the labor are in that particular country, and we have the 5 different sub-indices. So the related data set, which is also coming from CDR, which measures shareholder protection in each country, right? So in a very, very similar way. So now they look at the shareholder rights and the corporate governance policies. And then, so this index covers the following aspects. Yeah, for example, that's the, so the corporate governance policies, like, for example, so the agenda setting power of the corporate board structure and so on. And yeah, for example, so this mandatory bid requirements, so that's related to company acquisitions and takeovers, and also, for example, disclosure of the major share owners, right? So that data set is from 1990 to 2013. So the most kind of important data set in this paper coming from this, the paper by Vulke, which I mentioned in the, to slide 4. So they do this, so the big literature analysis. So they look at the, so the almost 1,500, so the politicians, and then they classify them as populist or not. So depending on their political rhetoric and promises. And then, so out of 60 countries, so they find that, so there are almost 26 countries, so they experience some sort of, so the populist government in the history. And then they differentiate between the left-wing populist parties and also right-wing populist parties. So the main kind of differences coming from the left-wing populist parties. So they target so the economic elite and the capitalists and oligarchs, while the right-wing populist parties, so they target foreigners, ethnic and religious minorities. So we have the populist, so general measure, and then we differentiated whether that populist government is left or right? So our combined data set covers 60 countries. So in the period between 1970 till 2018, and out of 60 countries, so 26 experience so the at least one populist episode in that so time span. And then some countries they have experienced very long so the period under the populist government, like the Argentina, Slovakia, Venezuela. Some other countries, they have so the multiple populist episodes, but very short time. And there are some countries they experience so the both left and right populism, which is sometimes quite unusual. So that's how the data set looks like in terms of the populist murder. So we have countries with no populism, of course. We have countries with left populism, and also we have countries with right populism. And then we have time from 1970 till 2018. So in terms of modeling, right? So we use standard two-way fixed effect model. We also control for the lag dependent variable, because those index, so the labor regulation index is kind of to account for the dependence on different lags. So we estimate the dynamic model actually. So that's very similar to the Acemoglu paper, who studies the the impact of transition to democracy on economic growth, which is kind of very similar setup to ours. And so he also used the 3 lags in the model. We also control for some sort of time varying control variables. We have obviously time fixed effects, so country fixed effects. And yeah, we try to get as clear estimates as possible at this stage. Yeah, so the one important clarification is that the variation in the data set coming from transition to populism and also transition back, right? So once the index changes from 1 to 0 and 0 to 1, right? So that's, yeah. Yeah, so for example, that's kind of illustration in kind of one case study like Slovakia. So that's, so those gray areas, so they represent the populist areas. And then we have, so my time is up?
It's almost up, yeah.
Okay, and so we find that the populist episode is associated with high labor regulation and no significant changes in the shareholder protection. And so that's mostly comes from the left wing, so the populist parties, rather than right wing, so the populist parties. And so that's the heterogeneity. So that's mostly coming from laws that are related to the individual labor right rather than so the collective labor rights. And so in terms of the corporate shareholder rights, so we see that so the mandatory, so the bit which is related to the hostile takeovers, so that's negative, and so the disclosure of major shareholder, that's positive. And so one last remark, so that have some sort of, so the political economy motivation, because so the populist government, so they do not provide the protection for everyone, so they are very selective. They might provide some sort of protection of individual labor rights, not the collective labor rights, which is related to so the previous slide, so the industrial actions and employee representation. And also in terms of the corporate governance structure, they promote transparency, but then they can use that information to target those, so the large businesses to achieve their political goals. And we also have the dynamic analysis, but there is no time. Yeah, that's my 15.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Yeah, I have a question. This is a very interesting work for me, really. I really enjoy it. Just about the populism thing,
Yeah.
because you saw a dummy for populism,
Yeah.
and I was looking the face of Douglas actually, because you consider, for instance, you consider all the period of Lula as populism. So I'm not sure if for instance for Casmude this is going to be like populism. Even for Casmude, Donald Trump is not populist. It's just white supremacist and white nationalist. You know, so maybe you're going to you will have to like arguing very well why all of these things like can be considered populism, because as I understood there is also far-right phenomena, anti-elitism, anti-establishment issues, and none all of them are populism. So I mean maybe it's going to be challenging to arguing this, you know, because in political science right now, I know that they are using like not a dummy variable, but also a scale, you know, with a specific, you know, I don't know, the specific points, you know, and not just this is populism or this is not populism, you know, yeah. More like challenging phenomena. This is my only comment about this, yeah.
Yeah, so that question is very well taken. So if someone come up the continuous measure, so how to define the populist, that's a huge contribution in the field. So unfortunately, so I'm kind of really on that particular the definition, and so they consider a leader as a populist, so in that case it's a dummy variable. And then, so it's time invariant, right? So if that politician is considered a populist, so it remains so the populist for the entire, so the period of his government or her government, right?
Yes, Clara.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm a bit curious about the counterfactual and whether or not you could try to define it as you did, but also in another way. So I'm thinking of Macron. big labor reform, but not a populist, and not in your sample. And that led me to think, okay, but if like a labor reform is something that kind of stays in time quite a lot generally, can it be used in that conversation, or how should it be located in that conversation in order to account for kind of other ways it could be changed? So now you don't have Macron, you don't have this labor reform. Would it be very different?
So,
Because now your counterfactual is the own country, right? You don't have other countries.
yeah, so in that kind of two-way, so the fixed effect model, so I also have Macron, so the government is a control group. So yeah, I'm comparing the countries, so the overtime, and then so the comparing some other countries with no populist
So
government.
it's 3-year treatment.
Yes, kind of. And so that means that I also have non-populist government, and then so also the labor regulation and the reform, but they appear in the control group, in my case.
Douglas, please.
Yeah, so thank you very much for your presentation, and happy that you saw that. Maybe you want to double check your database, because I also thought a bit, something that I'm not quite sure in terms of Brazil specifically, but maybe you also want to make a distinction within populism when you are looking at authoritarian regimes and democratic regimes, right? So I think it's quite unfair to place, for instance, Venezuela in the same group as, let's say, other democratic left-wing, if you will, even populist parties, because it's not a democratic regime. So like what you have, so let's say shareholders' rights or workers' rights will be treated is a bit different, I suppose, under a non-democratic regime, right, authoritarian regime. And also, maybe it might be interesting, it's not quite clear to me if you just count it when, as a populist, when the leading political party, or when parties in the coalition are populist as well.
Okay, so according to that paper, which I'm taking that database, so it's about leaders. So whether the head of the government is a populist. So maybe the government is the coalition government, but the head of the government, so the kind of the guy who is in charge of making important decisions, is a populist or not.
Okay, let me just two questions. First, on the scale that Pedro was highlighting, you have a dummy populist, non-populist, etc. You might want to check the Chapel Hill expert survey, in which they look at the degree of populism on an 11-point scale between 0 and 10. And then you can classify the parties that are in government on that. And that will give you a more nuanced sort of interpretation, which might address some of the queries that we see here. Second thing, and I'm looking at your graph here. I'm glad that you stopped here, or I stopped you here, because in the end, the paper that you're coming from, which is Funke, says populism is bad, and this is what most people think, including myself, that when you have a populist regime in the long term, you end up like Argentina, going from 3rd or 4th, 5th country in the world in terms of income per capita to a country that has become, to a certain extent, a basket case, in which populists replace each other, and within the same party, you have extreme right-wing populists and you have extreme left-wing populists, like in the premise. But when you look at your results are different, because you don't go just for economic growth, you go for many other things. And you say, yes, the mandatory bids, you have a negative impact, and the disclosure of major shareholders, you have a positive impact. But what I see is mainly there's no impact.
Yeah.
But everything is, all the others are, it doesn't matter whether you're populist or not. So our populism is not that bad.
So there's kind of my concluding slide, which I wanted to show, is that.
Yeah, put it there very quickly.
So let's talk about on those slide. Yeah. So the graph. So the interesting pattern is that exactly. So the most of the aspects of the regulation, which does not have this kind of the political background, like for example, the de facto power, the corporate board. So those are the effect, because even the populist government, they do not want to change, but they make changes in very specific aspects of law, which has the political the motivation for them to maintain the power. So for example, that mandatory bid law, which relaxed this regulation, which is which helps the hostile takeovers. So the hostile takeover means that the company can be acquired without their the own kind of will to be sold out. So that's happening in Hungary when the companies that are related to the Orban, so they take over some media companies, newspaper, so the TV media. So even though those companies they did not want to be sold out. So that type of relaxing that type of regulation that helps the companies that are related to the populist government take over some independent companies. So that makes this one easier. And in terms of the disclosure, so why that is kind of significant, so the very high, so in terms of money, because even though the populist government, so they promoted transparency, right? So the populist government, then they can use that information to target those politicians who are the alternative power in the country. So that's why the populist governments, they do not change everything. They change only some aspect of the regulation in terms of corporate governance or the worker rights to maintain their own power. And that's why, so if we translate this to economic terms in the long run, that can have very negative the economics of the concept, because that's kind of links to the state capture, so political connections, so the misallocation of government resources and so on. So kind of that's make this work kind of interesting, because not everything is zero. So the most of them is zero. Some aspect which really matters is not zero, which means that the populist government are really strategic. So once they decide how to change the laws.
We can definitely leave it there. So thank you very much, Jacqueline. And now, without further ado, we go to Douglas. Douglas Nunes de Sousa from the Europa-Universität Flensburg in Germany, right at the border with Denmark. And we are moving away from, in this case, populism and innovation and mining closures. And we're going to talk about higher education. Higher education in Europe's knowledge economies, implications on national and regional stakeholders for higher education policies. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andres. Thank you very much, everyone. Yes, came along. So I'm presenting something here, trying to present something very briefly, which is actually part of a broader project, which is my dissertation, actually. And I'm trying to, due to the time constraints and so on, I'm trying to limit it to a very specific aspect of it, which I'll tell you in a minute. So I also actually social disclosure, so I also work in the Department of Comparative Political Economy. So my background might be a bit different to some of you. So that's trying to make sure that everyone's on the same page here in terms of the presentation in a minute. So as I say, so that it's as Andres also presented. So I look at the knowledge economy, so higher education within the scope of the knowledge economy, and kind of try to understand, well, what about the stakeholders in the legitimate economy, which I'll cover in a minute. We talk a lot about institutional design, talk about, look a lot of macroeconomics into it, but I think apparently stakeholders also have an important role there in terms of higher education policies. And I see the knowledge economy as a very peculiar and very unique moment. It's a part of history that economic growth heavily or profoundly depend on knowledge. Of course, for different reasons that I'm not going to cover today, some skill sets or some disciplines, if you're in higher education, are favored. So such as science, technology, engineering, mathematics. And what you see or what expect that if you perceive and this trend you sustain over time because of, at least in the developed world, because of course, the type of economic activities to remain here, which are linked to high value added service and manufacturing, right? Of course, some of this debate, some of this development predates the knowledge economy, social globalization, so on, but I don't think that's the scope of the presentation today. In corporate public economy, it's, the literature that have been kind of used and kind of have been very influential has been parts of competence approach and growth models to understand, how institutions work, of course, in this case, read as education as an institution too. I see the two of them competing at literature's competing approach, of course. Of course, there are some similarities,
For those not familiar, here we look more institutional complementarity. So, strong focus on vocational training, for instance, wage bargaining setting, and so on. And here kind of bring more macroeconomics to debate, look at most important aggregate demand and so on. But the whole idea is, well, okay, so within the comparative political economy, literature kind of say, well, that's kind of settings, this kind of institutional design, macroeconomics kind of decide how higher education policies are set, basically, educations are set more broadly. However, when you plot it, so there's a lot going on here. I'll try to explain very briefly. When you plot it, first you look at you control for a relevant sector of the economy, let's say manufacturing here, and you look at graduates on these very prominent fields within the scope of knowledge economy. When you look at the literature that I have just mentioned, you cannot really see a trend here. So in terms of parts of countries, you see Germany there, Sweden here, the UK here, there is Ireland. Doesn't quite fit well. So there is no common, you cannot really see a pattern here. Maybe you can make up a plan, but look at growth models, right? There is one age of the quarters there. Well, but when you look at, for instance, the extended literature on growth models, for instance, FDI-led, so you have you just do not have a common pattern because, for instance, in this book that I just showed, there's a chapter that talks about FDI-led growth models, so the Ireland and Latvia, it's here. So kind of doesn't fit it. So my take is, well, actually, there's something else going on, which I say that's the stakeholders interaction. So what I do here, I do a comparative case study. Kind of how I came up with this case selection. Well, I look at countries with rates on higher education, these relevant fields, and I look at the EU average here, what the week rate, because for 2019 is before COVID, the data. And what you see, I look at Ireland as an extreme case, and try to say, well, Ireland does extremely well in terms of graduates in STEM, and try to compare it to a more, let's say, a normal case, a case which is more similar to the EU mean, which is the case of Spain. So for time constraints and so on, I'll just focus on the case of Spain here. Okay, I'm not going to talk about Ireland. We don't have the time to do that. Maybe you can have a talk another moment opportunity. In addition to that, because I'm not looking at necessarily the institutional level, it's part of this, it's part of the story, of course, but mainly looking at stakeholders. So I look at the territorial dimension as well. And then here it's because of in higher education, normally these partnerships, this interaction with stakeholders, they tend to be regional, partnerships with industries and so on. So and then I look at the region which has let's say high and low knowledge intense sectors, employment and knowledge intense sectors. In the case of Spain, I look at the region of Catalonia and Andalusia, the one that we're going to try to cover here. So I use descriptive statistics, and then we do some structured interviews as well with some key stakeholders that identify, which are mainly employer association, universities, and regional and national political authorities. Those are the two regions that I look at. So that's Andalusia and Catalonia. Okay, so maybe I'm not going to spend much time here because I think you're quite familiar with the economy regional difference in terms of Spain and so on. So I'm just very briefly just to give you a broader some background information in terms of the difference in GDP composition within the regions Catalonia and Andalusia compared to Spain. So you know that in Andalusia we have less industry than Catalonia, the rest of the country, agriculture plays an important role, and this type of thing. So I don't think I have to spend much time there. Maybe I can spend more time here explaining a bit, very briefly, the higher education system, the Spanish higher education system. It's a decentralized education system. Of course, the legislation at the national level shall apply equally among the regions, and the regions are accountable for the governance of the system and so on. And the universities themselves, they are autonomous, right? They have decision-making process that are made these college bodies. And of course, there is the law, the reform from 83 introduces this bodies called the Consejo Social, which are,
bodies, councils that incorporate members of the civil society and which can also include industries and firms with builds a bridge of the university. Of course, you can say, well, what role do they play? Kind of they approve the budgets of Mr. Universities, so somehow they have some power. Yeah. And the system is it's public and private universities, not the same public university that read as the UK. It's a very different system, and have 50 public and 36 public universities. Although they are around 50 public and 36 private. And how is that distributed here? Which seems it's a bit of statistic, I know, but might be important for the point I'm going to make later on. So you see Andalusia, so here there is just one private university, and you have at least one, have 10 public universities there, at least one per province. In Catalonia is more, even divided, so you have 7 and 5, 7 public and 5 private. In the case of Andalusia, just very briefly, what you see there in terms of how education, what type of profiles, of course, that offer there and so on, and how education has been used there, has been very much used to promote social mobility, kind of a tool to promote social mobility. In which, in terms of the university programs, the profile that they offer, they're very similar. So the universities are very similar. There are no Polytechnic University in Andalusia. They're very similar. They tend to offer the same kind of programs, regardless within region, the differences, economic difference within the region, so in the province level, right? Some province I don't have the time to show here, just have to believe me, this one. But some reasons they have more agriculture, industries, and so on. But regardless of these regional differences, at the province level, the universities, as represent the supply side of labor force, if you will, they don't very much have very loose link with the labor market. And another argument that's made there as well, much because of the limited industries if you compare to other regions of Spain, for instance, Madrid or Barcelona, or Catalonia, but more precisely Barcelona, there are limited opportunities for skills. At the same time, Catalonia is a bit different in the sense of, there is a prominent presence of private universities there. What you saw in this, the case of Catalonia is that private universities do play a very important role in terms of building this bridge with the private sector, of the industry sectors. Not necessarily industry in the sense of the industrial sector, but the service economy, which is very prominent in the region of Barcelona. So mostly in terms of business schools are very prominent there. And they are kind of trying to, meet the demands of those service industries, so pretty business schools. What you see that as an outcome of that has added pressure on the system, the public system. And the public system, it's kind of, we attribute in the research because of this kind of vibrant university system that you have there. The public system kind of needs to catch up, and you can see they have been much more creative, if you will, in terms of particularly degree portfolio as well. So the programs that are offered there. The only thing that you see in the case of Catalonia is still very disconnected in terms of higher education policy, industrial policy. They're not very loose connected, not kind of well integrated. Just going to finish, go to stakeholders. I had some regressions and some tables to show you, but I decided to leave it up. Just please believe me. And if you want them, I'm also happy to show you, to send to you later on a different opportunity if you want to see the claims that I'm making here, how they are relevant. So just to finish them here, so what you see, in spite of this difference, what you see some similarities with in terms of the regions as well. So what, as core actors, core stakeholders shaping policies, in those cases, we see the quality insurance agencies as those who actually decide which program will be insured or not. We see lobbying group and really lobbying group as professional colleges mainly, right? So they have very strong lobbying power in terms of putting a cap in terms of which programs will open, and also limiting
who you graduates for new programs probably which jobs they will offer or be able to undertake the labor market. And also see universities themselves, they are very permanent actors in the sense of which programs policies will be, especially in terms of degree portfolio. So it's more about, you know, what type the department ability to kind of offer enough teachers and so on. When you look at reforms, and that's promised in my very last slide, when you look at reforms though, the actors, the stakeholders that shape reforms, policy reforms, they tend to be a bit different. So they tend to be so representative of the rectors, so the council of rectors at the national and regional level, and also firms. But that's only firms, large firms within key core regional economic centers for those regions. So I think I'll finish here. So the idea that I want to bring is that, well, it's not only about the institutional design of countries, but also about stakeholders. And that's kind of why I cannot really show here because I should look in the case of Spain, but when you compare to Ireland, you can see why there is no pattern when you see in terms of the knowledge economy and Spain.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. I wonder whether if I think to Italy, to my country, it's I would put, for example, in the stakeholder also some aspect of bureaucracy. For example, there is the case in Italy of there is a huge debate about Italy the degree diploma as a legal value, and there's been quite a struggle between many political forces because they want to abolish the legal value in order to like liberalize the market for diplomas. So you would have something like, you know, inflation, great inflation, but let's say diploma inflation. So that for everything every type of job promotion, you need a diploma. So I wonder whether these and in Italy, for example, to work in the armed forces, in the army or in many public jobs, you need a degree. That degree gives you 2-3 points more. You get a better ranking. So there are a lot of new small private universities that offer this diploma at much lower, a very high cost, but very low quality, let's say, of education. And so I wonder if some aspect of this bureaucracy, if you want, you consider them to be stakeholders in this process?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can just go through the case of Spain might be a better case. So in terms of like trying to select people going to enter the public service, basically, right? Sometimes they get points for being different. And well, that's what I'm saying, the role of quality assurance agencies, right? Because in the case of Spain, if the degree is not recognized or undergo the quality insurance process is not valid, it doesn't let you up the points. Of course, that depends on the sector, right? So if you go to, let's say, business schools, most of these programs, especially Barcelona, also in Madrid, they're not, they don't undergo any quality insurance procedure, basically because, I mean, they're not looking for this extra points to get into the public service, right? So it's much more industry-based, if you will. So of course, if you want to go to public service, of course, let's say you increase the role of quality insurance firm agencies in terms of setting the criteria or the influence over policy, higher education policies. But if you go to the public sector within the service, not. However, if you go to public sector where you have some professional colleges, physical medicine and so on, this lobby group, they tend to be very organized. So my answer is, well, it's very case-based, industry-based as well. Yeah, that's kind of the case.
Okay. Any other questions? So the question for you is the situation of Andalusia the result of the lack of specialization of universities, or does the lack of specialization of universities lead to the situation we have in Andalusia?
Yeah.
And to what extent can this be overturned?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think the case, if you just look at the scope of the knowledge economy starting from the 90s, you cannot really see the full picture, right? because industrialization, for instance, Catalonia started before that. So there is a historical structural differences there. What you see in the case of Andalusia is the combination of both. So the lack of integration of the lack of industries, if you will, and universities being very generalistic in the sense. So what we believe that how you overcome the situation is promoting. So what has been already been doing there in terms of look at, for instance, the technological part, for instance, initiative as also to bring those together. But then for that, universities have to be more specialized in trying to meet more, the idea is to integrate into their industrial policy. So kind of have a better strategy as opposed to just offering degrees that may not lead to employment or to lead to more economic growth in key areas that that have to be a certain degrees that has to be offered in terms to catch up with the knowledge economy.
All right, thank you very much. One small recommendation in terms of presentation skills. When you do a presentation, don't just, you've been moving backwards and backwards and backwards until we couldn't see you. So you do a presentation, you engage with the audience, so you stay here.
Yeah, it's just because I had some notes that I had to read.
Yeah, well, you don't have to read the notes. They have to,
Yeah.
you know your topic better than anyone else, so there's no need to go and read the notes. So last but not least, we have, and I told you you were going to have very limited time, you kept on asking questions. Pedro Fierro from the Adolfo Ibáñez University, Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez in Chile, and he's going to talk about feeling the split, territorial divide, and political emotions in the Chilean constituent processes. That has been finished, but has been finished with a massive fiasco.
Yeah. Actually, that's the main thing. As Andres said, I will talk about the relationship between territorial marginality, or territorial marginalization, and political emotions in the context of this Chilean constituent process. That I don't know if you know, but the current Chilean constitutions came from Pinochet dictatorship. So that's why we tried to write new constitutions. We failed. This is the spoiler. Actually, Andres said, and we failed twice. And this is the last spoiler that I will do. So this is going to be like a very general presentation, just to share the idea and hoping to have some feedback. This is the first time that I will talk about this project, about this paper. And just to get the vibe of the situation, Chile was used to be seen as a very strong country in Latin America, like with strong institutions, with very stable political parties, and with a very strong rule of law as well. And actually, this is a statement made by the president, our former president, Sebastián Piñera, in October 9 in 2019. He said in a very popular TV program that Chile was an oasis, an oasis in Latin America, particularly related with the problems that Paraguay was facing and Colombia, actually, with the terrorism and all these things. We had, as I said, very good economic health and very strong institutions. This was on October 9 in 2019. Just 1 week after these declarations, this was the reality. Just 1 week, literally, in 19 October in 2019, with massive protests, 2 million people in the street. We're a country of 18 million people. So we're talking about the 10% of the people in the streets asking for better health system, for the, protesting because of the security system as well, because of the education. But in parallel, there was a lot of distractions, violence, lottery. Most of the small market owners lost everything in this week.
So you mean looting, not lottery?
Looting, yes, looting. And actually, then arrived the pandemic. This is like the global issue, So the process started like diminishing a little bit. So we're talking about a country with obviously as the global phenomena, it's like with a very like prominent economic crisis because of the pandemic as well, with a very strong, I think, political polarization, not just in the people, but also in the elites, in the political system, and with instability. And I'm not talking about just political and social stability, but also emotional stability. These are two news from the last week, just the last week. We were facing the second most lethal fire in the world last week. This was the main news in The Guardian, the same day that the King Charles announced that he has cancer. No? But this was the main news. Just 5 days ago, I took the picture yesterday, so just 5 days ago, Sebastián Piñera, former president that I show you, died in a very tragic accident in his helicopter. And he was like not just our former president, but also a very important figure because he actually started this constituent process, and it's very like, I don't know, people have different opinions about him. So it's a very important character in the recent Chilean history. So as you can see, the emotional mood in the country is not the best. We are like facing a very bad time right now, but also for the last like 5 years because of the global issues that we have. So this is going to be the only slide that I will show you about the constituent process, which is the context of this work. We had this massive protest, 2 million people in the street, a lot of destruction in the street, violence. And in November 15, the President Piñera and with all the political parties, and I mean the democratic political parties, decided to offer to the people a political agreement, trying to offer an institutional exit to this conflict that we were facing. And this political agreement was a new constitution. So all of this started with this proposal, and after that, the people vote if they wanted to have a new constitution. The proposal was just the constituent process, not a constitution. I mean, just the constituent process. And 80% of the people vote in favor of these new constitutions. So we choose like an electoral, constituent members. They work for 2 years. They offer us very lefty and very populist left-wing constitutions, and the 62% of the people reject these lefty proposals. After that, we tried a second attempt. This time, the right-wing and very populist right-wing members were elected. They worked for a year. They proposed a new constitutions, and almost 60% of the people reject this new proposal. So we right now are very unique, because we are the only country in the world, as I know, that had rejected 2 constitutions via plebiscites. So this is like a territorial pattern of these votes. As you can see, the inhabitants of most of the city decided to reject both of the constitutions. These are in red. I did the math, and actually 1/3 of the cities, of the inhabitants of the 1/3 of the cities, rejected the constitution with no more than 10% of the margin of difference in the margin between one election and the other. You have to remember that this was with a left proposal and this was with a right proposal, and both of them were rejected by all the people, by all the cities. As you can see, in the public opinion, the traditional cleavage were not enough to answer this question. What's happened? I mean, why we have this double failure? Most of the political analysts were confused and with a lot of perplexity because of this process. And actually, unfortunately, the spatial dimensions, were not considered in order to explain this kind of failures. So the objective of this study is going to be super simple. It's super simple, but I think that it's very meaningful. And I try to analyze the influence of territorial marginalization in a very simple way in shaping negative emotions toward toward this constituent process. Both of them. The one in 2022 and the one in 2030. So I'm using data from a specific region in Chile, which is called the region of Valparaíso. It was one of the most affected regions because of the massive protests and the violence of this, because here is where the National Congress is situated. It's the only power of the state that is not in Santiago. I'm using the 10 most important cities of this region. I mean, the data came from the 10 most important cities of this region. And one important thing is that the two surveys that I'm using were collected at the end stage of both processes. Yeah. So we already had the draft of the new constitution. So this is like the boring part. I followed two approaches for trying to understand this phenomenon. The first one by using structural equation modeling. I mean, this technique allow us to have this factorial component analysis. I mean, the confirmatory factor analysis and the regression at the same time. So it's well used in political psychology and in the studying of political attitudes. So as you can see, I tried to create a factor of just negative emotion. And this was the first approach, by using the confusion, fear, uncertainty, and untrust. And these are the results of this. I found that basically the only factor in this very simple model, parsimonious model, in this whole, I found that the only factor that may influence both processes, the right-wing process and the left-wing process, was the territory. Yeah. And what is territory is living in the periphery of the regions. As I show you, I'm going to explain this, but these blue cities are, it's easier to explain the center. This is the center of the region, which is the capital city in the region and the conurbation, when the affluent people lives. And I consider all the rest as the periphery. You know? Actually, most of this side are trying to create a new region because they feel like abandoned by this capital city. You know? So it's a good proxy to understand the places that don't matter in a sort of way. So as I was saying, the only variable that explains with the same sign and with the same statistical significance is the territory. We can see difference in the ideology in the first process, obviously, because the first process was led by the left wing, as I said. So obviously, the people that identify themselves with the right, they tend to have more negative feelings toward the process. But the only one that explains both processes is the territory. And the second approach is what the literature in emotions call the discrete approach, but it's basically do the same, but with the different emotions. You know? So these are different regressions, and these are the coefficients. And it's just to confirm that in the case of the first constituent process, the people who live in the periphery of the regions tend to feel more mistrust or distrust, uncertainty, fear, and confusion. And in the second one, it's a little bit different, because the particular emotion of fear change the sign. So the people indeed feel more distrust, uncertainty, and confusion, but those who live in the periphery tend to feel less fear. So with these preliminary results, what are like the final remarks of this? I know that this is like a very simple approach to the problem when we are trying to identify places that don't matter. I mean, I use this center periphery cleavage, which is like very popular in political science because of different reasons. But obviously, it will be super helpful to try to understand other kind of marginalization. You know, it's difficult with this data because it's just two surveys, so I don't have too much data to do that. Even when the cases are geolocated, but it's not enough. And the other thing is that it's important to consider the intra-regional centralization problem that we are facing in Latin America. It's not just about the problem in Chile with the capital city, which is Santiago, all the people live in Santiago, all the people work in Santiago, and all the good things happen in Santiago. this is a big problem, but people that are living in peripheral places are also facing another kind of centralization with these interregional, problems. And the last one, this is more like an opinion, but I mean, based on evidence. Actually, we were doing an experiment with the Ohio State University in Chile in the second constituent process, trying to invite people to the deliberative process, the deliberative process mechanism with constituent members. And actually, because of participating, this was a very big experiment with 10,000 people in the control group, 3,000 people participating in these conversations. And we saw that these kind of emotions got better, when after the participation in this kind of mechanism. The problem is that the official participation mechanism that we have in both processes were designed just to offer voice for those who had already voice. So I think that we have a very big challenge in these terms. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time for a couple of questions. Yes.
Small question, I mean, maybe I missed it, but the regions that you distinguish as periphery, I mean, do you have information about anything, any demographic or socioeconomic things? So, I mean, would it be interesting to, rather than putting a binary there, to control for it? I mean, I don't know if it's possible. I mean, I don't know how many regions are there, but it could be interesting because there is also some discussions about this places of this discontent where we combine like
definitely. It will be super helpful. Just a few things about this. This is a survey that just considered urban areas. So there's no like rural, urban cleavage, and there are some big cities that are considered in the periphery, because are not in this center. So it's a very good question. I must include this. Yeah.
Yeah, very much related to that point. So one kind of so the confounder might be the education, right? So those people, they are supporting the other types of the constitutions, right? And maybe the center and the periphery, they are very different in terms of level of education and understanding the politics in general, right? So but I think that those findings are really interesting. So
we control by education, but you have a good point because there is a difference in Chile between the education of the individuals and the education of the householder. And maybe we can try to identify those places where the family is less educated. I mean, those places that the family that are less educated are residing, and this could be a good proxy in order to identify other kind of marginalization. But in this case, I'm controlling by education, but it's a very good point.
Yeah, I was just thinking that maybe if they have moved to an urban area, they will reply to the survey, but they've gone from a rural. So I don't know if you have information on that.
Yeah, but these are just urban areas, because the survey just consider urban areas. Where when we're talking about periphery, it's other kind of periphery. It's not the rural phenomenon.
Yeah, but if they maybe were born in a rural area.
Yeah.
Do you have information on that?
No, but in the last survey, we asked to the people for the funds, in order to have some qualitative information. Because actually in political science, there is one of the most important papers on these things. It's about the rural conscientiousness, and the political resentment because of these things, So it will be super interesting to analyze that. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so let me just wrap it up very quickly. You raised a very important issue, which is it about reality or is it about perceptions of reality?
Yeah.
And perceptions and reality might be the same, but they might very often not be the same. I mean, I've been keeping on asking my friends in social psychology that should become interested in this sort of issues because it is important. You're highlighting, well, it's not about economic decline, but it's also not about a lot of, let's say, traditional cultural factors. But you highlighted one thing, which is people are less discontented among because of the centralization within regions. And of course, what we have seen in the past, and we know this for a long time, is that inequality is not greatest across regions, but is within regions. You have in a city like London far greater inequality than between London and the rest of the UK. But in most countries, the rich and the poor, the excluded and the non-excluded in big cities are voting together. Is the people that feel disgruntled or with real reasons or without real reasons that are voting for anti-system parties. This might not mean that in the future our cities might not explode. Is Chile at the forefront of that movement, saying there is a different type of anti-system or reaction against the system that is something that we have not seen yet in most developed and developing countries or emerging countries?
I'm not sure if we are in the phasing of this process, but definitely this is not just about segregation. You know, this is not vulnerable people. Actually, in other paper we were facing this discussion, and we test a lot of things with campamento, which is like this. I don't know how you can say this in English. The campament where people are not formal, living not formal
shanty towns.
Yeah, but this kind of. So we try to test different things, and yeah, it's not about that. It's more about like a political sentiment that they are facing, but since a while. You know, it's not like it's not because of economic, you know, but because of the economic performance of these regions or the recent economic decline. That's why I was asking about Turkey. But yeah, maybe you're right. I mean, I'm not sure if I get the question, but yeah, I think that this is different. At least it's different to the developed countries. I think there's not too much difference in the Latin American continent. You know, that's why I think that I'm not sure if Chile is like in the face of this thing. You know, but yeah.
Okay,
Sorry.
so thank you very much, Pedro. We have a packed schedule of presentations coming now almost every week at the Cañada-Blanch Centre. We start on the 22nd of February with Commissioner Elisa Ferreira, the Commissioner for Cohesion and Reforms in the European Union. That's going to be a big event in the Old Theatre. Then on the 27th, we have the President of the British-Spanish Society, Jimmy Burns-Marignon, presenting his last talk about spies at the LSE. You might think that your friends and your colleagues look normal, but there might be spies, so just beware. Then the week after, on the 4th, we have Luis Dijkstra from the European Commission talking about the future of cities. And on the 5th, we have the ambassador of Spain, in this case, Jose Marco, who's going to come and talk about how society is changing and the relationship and what's the role of Spain in that society. And then we move, and I think it's on the 25th of March, is the last one. We'll have Salvador Illa, who was the former Minister of Health during the pandemic, and the socialist candidate for the president of the region of Catalonia. So those of you here and those of you at home are watching on YouTube from the comfort of your homes, I just encourage you to come and to actually, if you have any doubts or any questions or any urgent questions that you want to ask all these prominent people, to come to our events, because the Cañada-Blanch Centre is alive and kicking, and we have quite a lot of activities that are being developed with as will happen. So thank you very much for all. And I think many of us will be going for dinner. So thank you.
Yes.
think that you see it's those. They still know that, how much of those.